In Boise, Idaho, it took Megan exactly 47 hours to realize someone had been documenting her every move from the basement. But by then, they'd already perfected their study of her patterns. From the depths of my collection, the Nightmare Maestro brings you a tale that will make you question if the subtle changes in your daily routine are truly random or part of someone's meticulous research. In the twilight hours of an October evening, a red Honda Civic pulled into the driveway of 1247 Maple Court. The motion-activated security light flickered to life a fraction of a second late, a delay so subtle that Megan Mitchell didn't notice as she collected her overnight bag. Through the windshield, warm yellow light spilled from the windows of the two-story colonial, every lamp exactly where it should be, precisely as bright as memory suggested. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the quiet cul-de-sac in deepening shades of purple. Her parents' departure for their anniversary weekend in Sun Valley had been delayed by Dad's last-minute conference call, but they'd finally gotten on the road an hour ago. Their request for her to house-sit had been casual, Mom worried about the plants, Dad about the pipes and the forecast cold snap. Simple enough. The wind chimes tinkled from the front porch, copper tubes her father had hung decades ago. Their song seemed slightly off-key tonight, though Megan couldn't quite place why. Her hand found the hidden key in its magnetic holder beneath the mailbox, muscle memory from countless teenage returns past curfew. The lock turned with a familiar click, though it caught for just a moment longer than usual. The house welcomed her with the mingled scents of Mom's cinnamon plug-ins and Dad's coffee maker, programmed to shut off hours ago. Everything sat in perfect order. Family photos arranged on the entryway table, mail sorted into neat stacks, shoes lined up by the door. Almost too perfect, as if each item had been deliberately placed rather than naturally accumulated. Winston, their gray tabby, emerged from his favorite sunspot to wind between her legs. His movements seemed hesitant, testing each step before committing his weight. Megan scratched behind his ears, noting how the setting sun threw strange shadows through the dining room windows. Had that corner always been so dark? She flicked on another light. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mom checking she'd arrived safely. Megan tapped out a quick reply, assuring them all was well. The message showed just one bar of service, typical for their neighborhood's notorious dead zone. She'd have to remember to charge overnight. The battery already hovered near 20%. In the kitchen, the ancient landline phone sat in its cradle on the counter, its red message light dark. Mom insisted on keeping the service active despite Dad's protests about the expense. For emergencies, she always said. The handset looked freshly dusted, though Megan couldn't remember her mother ever cleaning it. The house creaked and settled around her as night fell properly. Each sound seemed precisely timed, as if the house was performing a well-rehearsed symphony of familiar noises. Megan went through the motions of securing the house for the evening, checking locks, drawing curtains, setting the coffee maker for morning. Everything normal. Everything safe. Everything exactly as it had always been in this house she knew by heart. Only later would she realize that this perfection itself was the first warning sign, the evidence of someone who had studied their habits long enough to recreate them flawlessly. The evening passed with calculated quietness. Megan settled into her old spot on the living room couch, half watching reruns of sitcoms she'd seen a dozen times before. Winston perched beside her, but his usual relaxed purring was replaced by an alert stillness, his ears constantly swiveling toward the slightest sound. The familiar routine felt choreographed, as if someone had studied and recreated the perfect scene of domestic tranquility. Her phone died around midnight, She'd forgotten about the charging reminder. No matter, she thought. She'd plug it in upstairs before bed. The TV droned on, its blue light creating shifting patterns across the walls that seemed to move with unusual purpose. Her eyelids grew heavy, each blink lasting longer than the last, as if some external force was orchestrating her descent into sleep. The harsh electronic trill of the landline shattered the silence. Megan jolted awake, heart hammering. The clock on the cable box read 2:13 a.m. Exactly 2:13, the digits almost too precise. Winston was gone, but she hadn't felt him leave. The phone rang again, its vintage tone cutting through the darkness with surgical precision, as if calibrated for maximum psychological impact. Standing made her realize how stiff she'd become on the couch. She shuffled toward the kitchen, bare feet silent on the cool hardwood. The phone's ring echoed with an unnatural clarity, each tone identical to the last. Who would call a landline at this hour? Wrong number, probably, or a scam, though those usually struck during dinner hours, when people's guards were lowered by routine. Her hand found the receiver. "Hello?" Static crackled softly on the line. Not random interference, but a carefully modulated white noise, like someone had studied the exact frequency needed to unsettle human ears. Then, nothing. No voice, no recorded message. Just the faint sound of air moving across a microphone. Measured breaths timed precisely to her own racing heartbeat. "Hello?" she repeated, sleep-thick voice, stronger now. "Anyone there?" The breathing continued for exactly 3 more seconds. She counted them unconsciously. Then a click, followed by the hollow drone of a dial tone, perfectly pitched to resonate through her bones. Megan replaced the receiver slowly, suddenly aware that the darkness pressing against the windows had depth, texture, intention. Even the TV's muted glow seemed precisely calculated to create the deepest possible shadows, rather than dispelling them. She found herself straining to hear any sound beyond the usual house noises that now seemed to follow a pattern, a rhythm she'd never noticed before. "Don't be ridiculous," she chided herself. Wrong numbers happened. Scam calls dropped. Cell phones had bad connections. All perfectly normal explanations that felt rehearsed even in her own mind. Still, she found herself doing an extra circuit of the downstairs, checking the locks again. Each lock engaged with identical resistance, as if someone had carefully maintained them to produce the exact same feel. Winston watched from the stairs, eyes reflecting the dim light with unusual intensity. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. And that was precisely what felt wrong. Morning arrived with calculated brightness, Idaho sunlight streaming through windows that seemed to have been cleaned to a specific degree of transparency. Megan woke to find her phone charged but with no signal, typical for this part of the house, though now she wondered if the dead zone's boundaries felt too perfectly defined. Winston sat in his usual spot on the windowsill, but his attention wasn't on the birds outside. His eyes tracked something unseen, following a path through the room that seemed practiced. The previous night's unease should have felt foolish in the clarity of day. Instead, the house's precise order took on a new dimension. She went through her morning routine, borrowing her mom's coffee maker and favorite mug. The coffee brewed to exactly the right strength, as if someone had adjusted the measurements when no one was looking. By afternoon, Megan had settled into grading papers and watching Netflix on her laptop. She'd almost forgotten about the strange call until her attempt to order delivery failed. No cell service again. Her eyes drifted to the landline. The dust on its surface caught the light oddly, revealing swirled patterns too deliberate to be random. She found herself studying the phone's position on the counter. Had it always been exactly parallel to the edge? The shadows lengthened across the living room floor in perfect increments, like measurements on a ruler. She found herself checking her phone more frequently, willing the signal bars to appear. The house felt different as dusk approached. Spaces that had seemed cozy in daylight now revealed careful geometry in their angles and depths. Winston's behavior became increasingly methodical. The normally lazy cat moved from window to window at regular intervals, tail twitching to an unseen rhythm. Twice, he stopped at the basement door, staring at it with such focused intensity that Megan realized he wasn't watching for mice. He was watching for movement. She decided to cook dinner early, not wanting to deal with delivery issues again. As she chopped vegetables, a floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. She froze, knife hovering above the cutting board. The sound came again, not the random settling of old wood, but a deliberate test of pressure points. Someone had mapped the house's acoustic properties, learning which boards would sing and which would stay silent. The last rays of sunlight painted the kitchen walls in precisely measured bands of orange. Megan found herself counting the knives in the wooden block, noting their arrangement. Too perfect to be casual use. She jumped when the refrigerator's ice maker kicked in, the clatter of cubes falling in a rhythm that seemed almost coded. Her phone still showed no service. The basement door stood closed, its alignment suspiciously exact. Winston sat beside his full food bowl, untouched since morning, eyes fixed on a specific point in space behind her. Not searching, but waiting. Everything was calibrated. Everything was measured. Everything was performed. And somewhere in the house, the performance was about to enter its next act. Megan forced herself to eat dinner, measuring each bite mechanically. She'd positioned herself in the living room with studied sight lines to both the front door and the kitchen. The TV provided calculated background noise, but she found herself continuously muting it at precise intervals, analyzing the house's acoustic signatures, sounds that now seemed less random and more composed. At exactly 10:47 p.m., the landline's ring pierced her fragile equilibrium. She stared at the handset, pulse accelerating in measured increments. 4 rings, 5, 6, each identical in pitch and duration. On the 7th, she grabbed it, modulating her voice with deliberate control. "Who is this?" That same engineered silence answered. But this time, she could clearly hear breathing on the other end. Slow, deliberate, measured. Not natural respiration, but a carefully choreographed performance. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 2, exhale for 6. A rhythm designed to mirror and mock normal human patterns. "Stop calling, or I'm contacting the police." The threat emerged hollow, as if she were reading from someone else's script. The breathing continued, maintaining its precise cadence. Then the line died with surgical finality. Megan's hands trembled in controlled waves as she replaced the receiver. She needed help. Nicole would understand, wouldn't judge her for recognizing these calculated disturbances. But her cell phone remained obstinately silent. The dead zone's boundaries, too perfect to be natural. Her finger hovered over the landline's keypad, then stopped. A new understanding crystallized. The caller wasn't just watching, they were conducting. Each call, each silence, each response carefully measured and documented. A psychological experiment with her reactions as the dependent variable. Winston suddenly bolted from his perch, fur bristling in symmetrical patterns. He streaked past her toward the stairs, but stopped halfway up, back arched at a precise angle, his eyes fixed on the basement door with targeted intensity. The basement. She hadn't checked the basement. The thought struck with calculated force. She'd secured every window, every door, except the basement entrance. Dad's workshop was down there, with its separate exterior entrance for bringing in lumber. Had she checked that lock? Or had someone else been checking it, testing it, learning its tolerances? She couldn't remember. Or rather, her memories felt staged, arranged like props in a theatrical production. The basement door stood closed, its dark rectangle precisely framed by the hallway walls. The light switch waited at the bottom of the stairs. She'd have to descend into darkness to reach it, darkness that now seemed less empty and more composed. A text notification suddenly lit her phone, one bar of service, appearing with suspicious timing. Nicole's message glowed. "Everything okay? You've been quiet today?" Megan's thumbs flew across the screen. "Can you come over? Parents' house. Need help, please." The response arrived with predictable promptness. "On my way. 10 minutes." The landline rang again, right on cue. This time, Megan let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Each tone perfectly pitched to fray her nerves. Her fingers gripped the counter edge, knuckles whitening in precise increments. On the 4th ring, she lifted the receiver without speaking. A controlled experiment in silence. The breathing started immediately, not random or nervous, but methodically closer to the microphone. A calculated intimacy, as if the caller had rehearsed this moment countless times, perfecting the acoustics of fear. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. Each moment measured with scientific precision. Then a voice, engineered for maximum impact. "Why did you lock the basement door?" The receiver slipped from her numb fingers with choreographed grace, clattering against the counter in a precise percussion of plastic on granite. She hadn't locked the basement door. She hadn't even checked it. The voice had been male, mid-range, meticulously ordinary, calibrated to be forgettable. A voice that had practiced this moment, testing different inflections until finding the perfect tone to shatter her sense of reality. Her body moved through rehearsed motions, kitchen knife in hand, chosen for optimal grip and balance. Back against the wall, positioned for maximum peripheral vision. Eyes fixed on that basement door, studying its angles with new understanding. How long until Nicole arrived? 5 minutes? 7? Each second now measured against a predetermined schedule. A sound filtered up through the floor. Soft. Rhythmic. Footsteps executing a carefully planned choreography. The knife trembled in her grip, vibrating to an orchestrated frequency. The basement stairs were old wood, their acoustic properties mapped and mastered. She knew their sound from childhood, but now realized someone else had studied those same sounds, learning their music, composing with their creaks. These steps were a performance, each board selected for its particular note in this symphony of fear. Winston crouched at the top of the main stairs, every muscle tensed according to some unseen conductor's direction. His tail had swollen to 3 times its normal size, eyes fixed on the basement door. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not a warning, but a response to cues she couldn't perceive. Another step. Closer now. The movement of someone who had rehearsed this ascension countless times, perfecting their timing, their pressure, their presence, learning the exact moment when knowledge of their existence would create maximum psychological impact. Headlights swept across the front windows in a precisely timed arrival. A car door slammed outside. Nicole's voice called out, Megan? She wanted to scream, to warn her friend away. But the basement door stood between her and the front entrance, its position too perfect to be coincidence. One more step creaked from below, completing the composition. The front door handle rattled. Nicole still had her emergency key from high school. Metal scraped against metal in calculated friction. Winston bolted past Megan toward the sound, following his role in this carefully staged production. The basement door began to open with terrible, practiced precision. The next 30 seconds fractured into precisely calibrated moments of terror. Nicole's key turning in the lock with practiced friction. Winston's claws marking measured patterns on hardwood. The basement door's hinges releasing a carefully modulated groan. Megan's heartbeat accelerating in calculated intervals. She lunged for the front door just as Nicole stepped inside. The impact followed a choreographed trajectory, sending them both onto the porch. The knife traced a perfect arc through the air before landing with engineered precision. Nicole's confusion transformed into alarm, according to predictable psychological patterns. Without explanation, Megan slammed the door shut, her trembling hands engaging each lock in a sequence someone had clearly studied. Through the door's decorative window pane, they watched a shadow move across the foyer, not random or hurried, but executing a meticulously planned path. A man's figure, medium build, wearing dark clothing selected for optimal concealment. Nothing remarkable except the surgical precision of his movements, each step placed exactly where the floorboards wouldn't creak. Nicole already had her phone out, 911 dispatcher's voice carrying at a calculated volume. She recited the address while Megan's mind assembled the evidence with horrifying clarity. The landline calls, the footsteps, Winston's behavior, not isolated incidents but data points in an elaborate behavioral study. The intruder hadn't just been watching. He'd been conducting experiments, documenting responses, perfecting his methodology. Neighbors' lights activated in a domino effect, following sight lines the shadow had clearly mapped. He retreated from the foyer with measured steps, each movement demonstrating intimate knowledge of the house's blind spots. They heard the back door open and close with practiced quietness. Nicole's grip tightened on Megan's arm as understanding dawned. He'd learned every exit, every angle, every acoustic signature. The house had been his laboratory. Police sirens approached in Doppler-perfect waves. The figure would be gone before they arrived, disappearing through escape routes he'd rehearsed countless times. Megan's thoughts raced through the implications. How long had he studied her parents' routines? How many trial runs had he performed? How many hours had he spent testing the house's responses, calibrating his presence to remain just below the threshold of detection? Red and blue lights painted the cul-de-sac in strobing patterns. Officers swept the property with tactical precision, clearing rooms according to procedures the shadow had likely anticipated. Nicole held Megan on the porch swing, both watching the search through windows that now seemed less like barriers and more like observation points in a controlled experiment. The basement door stood open, revealing the darkness he'd used as his workshop. Winston crouched at the top of the stairs, fur bristling in response to lingering chemical signatures. Megan already knew what they'd find, not just evidence of occupation, but documentation of methodology. The basement hadn't been a hideout. It had been a research station. Police discovered his research center behind Dad's workbench, positioned for optimal acoustics and sightlines. The sleeping bag was arranged at precisely the right angle to catch ambient heat from the furnace. Empty energy drink cans and protein bar wrappers disposed of in a pattern suggesting calculated nutritional intake. But it was the notebook that revealed the true depths of his methodology. pages of meticulous documentation, written in architectural drafting pencil, sound propagation maps of the house's creaking points, thermal imaging sketches showing heat signature patterns through floors, precise measurements of every room's acoustic properties. Her parents' weekend plans weren't just noted, they were analyzed for behavioral consistencies, probability matrices for schedule deviations. The final chapter detailed Megan's arrival in clinical terminology. Timestamps for every door check, television volume adjustments, sleep patterns on the couch. Margin notes assessed her threat awareness levels, psychological response thresholds, pattern recognition capabilities. He'd been conducting a sophisticated study of human perception, testing how long he could exist in someone's space before the subconscious mind forced conscious recognition. They never caught him. The prepaid phone revealed only more layers of methodology, calls timed to specific psychological breaking points, breathing patterns modulated for maximum discomfort, no fingerprints because he'd studied skin oil degradation rates, no useful camera footage because he'd mapped every lens angle and blind spot in the neighborhood. He hadn't escaped. He'd concluded his experiment. The detective called it unprecedented, not just home invasion, but human behavioral research conducted without consent. The notebook contained theoretical frameworks for exploiting psychological blind spots, testing how the human mind normalizes subtle environmental changes. The landline calls weren't meant to frighten. They were calibrated stimuli measuring response patterns to auditory anomalies. Megan declined to house sit again. She bought a high-rise apartment with electronic surveillance and multiple backup systems. But she understood now that security wasn't about locks and cameras. It was about the spaces between security measures, the psychological gaps where someone could exist, testing and measuring and documenting, until they knew exactly how to become part of the background radiation of daily life. Sometimes, on quiet nights, she reviews the detective's analysis of the notebook's final pages, the ones describing his success criteria, achieving complete integration into a household's rhythms, becoming so much part of the environment that even a cat's heightened senses eventually accepted his presence. She thinks about all the empty spaces in all the quiet houses, wondering if they're truly empty, or if they're laboratories where someone is measuring and documenting and perfecting the art of existing in the corners of human perception. Because she knows the truth now. The most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural or violent. They're the methodical ones, the ones who study and measure and calculate, the ones who turn your home into a controlled experiment in human perception, the ones who don't want to harm you. They just want to see how long they can coexist with you before you notice them taking notes. If tonight's tale has you questioning the familiar sounds of your home, remember, the most dangerous predators aren't those who break in, but those who learn to exist within our blind spots. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Those moments when something felt subtly wrong, when the ordinary seemed too perfect, or when you sensed an unseen presence studying your daily routines. Don't forget to subscribe to the Nightmare Maestro's archive and activate notifications to ensure you never miss these carefully documented cases of real-world horror. After all, there are countless more stories where the monsters don't hide under beds. They take notes from inside them. Until next time, check your basement. And remember, just because you're alone in the house doesn't mean no one's watching you. Learn your patterns.